I'm a really big believer that sometimes inspiration and new learnings come from the most unexpected sources. In the past, we've gone outside of the mainstream to dissect the stories of truly incredible people. Let me give you a few examples. Mallory Wegman, she taught us about resilience through her personal story of fighting back after she was paralyzed after an epidural gone wrong. Or Admiral Stavridis, who took us on a journey of the go-to book for some of the most iconic leaders. Or who could ever forget Deloitte's very own Jen Fisher and her well-being story and why taking care of yourself is critical to thriving at work. Today, we are going on a similar adventure, but with a twist. I'm sitting down with a clown. No, not a metaphorical clown, a real clown, and I am 100% serious. Today, I'm interviewing Jeff Raz, a decorated clown, Cirque du Soleil performer, acrobat, author, speaker, founder, and executive communication guru. We are in San Francisco on a beautiful winter day. I think it's like 70 degrees out here. There isn't a cloud in the sky. And we're going to talk about some things that I'm hoping we're going to tie back to the whole point of this podcast. How do circus performers manage risk, and what can we learn from them? What can Jeff teach us about resilience? Advice that Jeff has for executives on the art of communicating and presenting with greater confidence. Tips for people in business looking to dip their toes in social media. And I may even ask why humor in the workplace is so important. Welcome to Resilient, where we hear from resilient leaders who share real insights through unfiltered stories. Core to Resilient are real-world experience from leaders who have lived through crisis, risk, and disruption. We look to learn about the leader, their stories, and what they would do differently. Basically, mine their learnings so that you can apply their insights into what you do. My hope is that you find a nugget or two during our conversation. So with that, let's get to my conversation with Jeff Raz. Jeff Raz, welcome to Resilient.
Thank you. It's nice to be here, Mike.
Absolutely. So I'm going to start with a off-the-wall question. You wrote an article in LinkedIn where you talked about why business people need to move like a clown. Please explain.
That came from a session I was leading at a pretty big startup, and it was on the second day, and one of the participants right away challenged me, said, "How do you move that way?" And you're looking at me, I'm not a small man. I am no longer a professional acrobat, which I was. And I'm in a suit. So I said, well, yesterday we went over those movement ideas and how you speak. He goes, no, I want the real stuff. How do you move like that? So I tried to joke. I said, listen, right. 40 years on stage, you start to get better at it. He just was not having any of it. And we did a quick session. I took 15 minutes out of our corporate training to go over how to use your body like a physical performer, like a clown or a physical actor, and some of the concepts. They loved it.
So, but why does a business person have to move like that? That's what I'm curious about.
What I think he had the right idea, which is a lot of communication is through movement. You try it out yourself, anyone who's listening. As you walk down the street, look at somebody quickly and then look away and notice the impression you've made. You have already made an impression about who that person is. And it's not from what they said. It's not from their resume. It's from how they're walking.
I was just in a training yesterday. 7 seconds is all it takes.
I think this participant in this corporate training had it right, that if you can move in a way that is authentic, that feels authentic, that is congruent with what you're saying. And if it's not congruent, that you're doing that on purpose for a comedic effect, which is what performers learn how to do. If it's intentional and authentic, which seem like an oxymoron,
right.
But that's what an actor learns to do. And this guy had spotted that and wanted it.
So you are probably one of the most interesting, and we're going to find this out, guests that I've had on Resilient to date. Maybe just a bit different because you come from a different world. And that's why I'm actually really excited to have this conversation. How did you get into becoming a clown? Like, what's the backstory on that?
The backstory was I come from an intellectual family. My father's was a physicist. My mother was a sociologist. My brother was a biostatistician.
And you're a clown now?
Exactly.
Yeah.
When I was 14,
Right.
you might imagine a 14-year-old's trying to find their place in this family.
Right.
And I learned to juggle at a Renaissance fair. I was working with some friends, and I could do it right away, pretty quickly. And it felt real and solid, and my brother couldn't do it. And I just loved it. And so I practiced all the time. And by the end of that Renaissance fair, I was taking other jugglers' acts and learning them. And I was so naive that I would go show them, say, listen, I learned your act, thinking that they would go, good kid. And of course they hated me for it. But that taught me very quickly the technique, but also taught me what the acts were. And so I was a juggler for a long time, and I became a professional juggler. And at a time when there weren't as many jugglers and they weren't as good as they are now.
Right.
So you could be good without being a crazy person, and you could make a living. And from that, I started working in circuses, and then I got the clowning part, and then went to theater school to get the acting part, and that all combined.
That all came together. So as a juggler, obviously not an easy thing to learn. Is there anything that you learned beyond just the art of juggling that you apply to your life now, or when you coach business people or anybody?
Surprisingly, absolutely, and in lots of ways.
Yeah.
The sort of the backstory is, to be a professional juggler, you need to juggle, at least I did, 6 hours a day. And so as a teenager, that's a lot of time
That's
juggling.
a lot of time.
And if you don't, it's really obvious. Things hit the ground. If you do,
Things don't hit the ground.
They don't hit the ground. And when you're a 15-year-old boy and girls will watch you, all of a sudden there's a really good reason for those 6 hours of practice. But just that discipline I use now and everything. I can sit down and focus for a long period of time. The other has to do with when you drop. And I know you and I have talked about this.
Yep.
But, you have two choices when you drop, because everyone knows you messed up. It's not like, did he or did nah. And dogs come.
You
and
drop
take
the
it.
ball or you drop the whatever. Yep.
So if at that moment you flinch and something goes off in your head that goes, oh man, I blew it, and then you pick it up and keep going, the audience goes, oof, it was a mistake. And you get away with a couple of them, but after a while they start to pile up. If, on the other hand, the moment you drop, you in your mind go, oh, now something new is going to happen, the audience will open up.
So you almost actually integrate it into your act to a certain degree.
That's a key lesson. And I'll sometimes, in corporate trainings, I'll juggle and try harder and harder tricks until I drop, and then get someone to throw the ball at me, and then I'll throw a ball back, and we'll start playing catch, and the whole room lights up, because it turns from, oh, he's a good juggler, we're all watching him passively enjoying the juggling, hopefully, into something very active where, oh, I'm throwing this, and it changes the whole room because of the mistake, which I call a golden mistake.
Have you been able to take that concept and ever coach somebody into how they potentially could apply that in the business world? I actually could think of a lot of ideas, but I'd be curious to get your thoughts.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure you can think of the technical problems.
Right.
The mic doesn't work, the slides don't work.
Right.
And at those moments, when the slides don't work, if you can go in your head, wonderful, they're not distracted. Let me tell you what I'm talking about without slides.
Right.
If the mic doesn't work, which did happen to me with Cirque du Soleil, we were performing and the entire soundboard crashed. And I was out on stage with 3,200 people in a tent with no band. And I thought, fabulous. They'll hear my voice from me, not from these speakers.
Right.
And the band's finally quiet. I've been waiting for shows to shut them up. And I actually got different laughs, and it was a different feeling in that tent. Now, you have to have skills. You have to be able to fill a tent with your sound. And in a corporate setting, you have to know your material and not leaning on the slides. You have to be able to look at people and talk about what you're an expert in,
Right.
without the crutch of the slides. But if you have enough skill and you can have that point of view, things will, the thing they will talk about afterwards were, man, he had that so down, he didn't need his slides.
Right. You know what? I was on a call yesterday, and we were negotiating a contract with a client, and our attorney was on. And she said, right when it went to her to start outlining, some of the attorney stuff, the points that she wanted to make, she said, oh my gosh, I got moved from my room. I'll be back in 5 minutes. And the whole call was focused on, the attorneys now negotiating the parameters of the deal. And it made me think of, in that moment, I kind of didn't take us all very seriously. And so we actually started to joke, because she was in 30 Rock, which is our national office. And we were able to joke that, it's one of the hardest rooms or buildings to get a room in. And then we moved to a conversation around how it's hard to get into 30 Rock during the summertime concert series. And so we actually just made it a playful moment, and actually kind of made the entire call, we dropped a levity, I guess. It was a light call after that. And I think part of it was we just didn't take the situation that seriously, and it allowed us maybe just to move into a better, different conversation. And then she got back on. And I actually think in some respects the call went better as a result of that.
I love that. You found, when the mistake happened, it was a moment for connection rather than for separation.
Exactly. I mean, at the moment we were like, oh my gosh, what are we going to say? It's kind of a tense moment, but we just kind of went with it and just felt better. So I guess my point I'm making is, to a certain degree, there's also just, don't take yourself so seriously in a moment like that, which I would imagine you probably see in circus or theater or what have you.
The way I'm going to interpret take yourself seriously is a little specific, which is don't start that tape that says either I messed up or she messed up, and things will go downhill. Because if that tape goes in, things will go downhill. If that other tape goes in, which is, this is a moment for connection. Right. It's not a big bad moment. It's a moment where we can be human beings. Things like what you just said happen.
Absolutely. So you played the dead clown in Cirque du Soleil, Corteo.
Yes.
You probably did hundreds of performances.
500.
Large audiences?
We had, in the U.S., we had 2,700 seats, and the tent was full most shows. In Japan, where the tent was full every show, 10 shows a week, we had 3,200 seats.
So I was going to say international. The question I have is, what role does the audience play in your performance?
A lot. Now, that's the nature of how I work, but it's also the nature of a clown. Okay. Is I'm in constant dialogue with the audience. And there are some actors who, some types of plays, where they will ignore the audience or know the audience is there. I heard the guy who's playing Hamilton in the Canada tour of Hamilton, he said, I can't think too much about the audience because we're such a cultural thing right now. If I start thinking about them, I'll get off. I know they're there. I feel their energy, but I can't be connected because that's a different show.
Sure, right.
For me, that's not it. I'm totally connected the entire time, and I'm trying to feel the difference between one laugh and another laugh, the difference between one type of silence and another type of silence. Very tuned in. And in Japan, where I was doing the show in Japanese, but I had learned 8 pages of dialogue, with a trainer, and I don't speak Japanese, but I had those 8 pages down, and I had to improvise at certain places. So I didn't share a language with them, and they were in the dark. So I had to feel connected. I just couldn't do the show without it and do my job right, in my opinion. So what I would do is, in full costume before the show, they have what's called animation, which is the performers come out. Anyone who's been to a Cirque du Soleil show knows the performers come out and play with the audience. Well, this animation was, let's look for the dead clown. That's me. Yep. So I couldn't be out there to do animation. So I would sneak out without anyone seeing, and I would walk in where the audience was coming in. I find a woman over 90. And in Japan, there are a lot of women over 90. And in full costume and makeup, I just put my arm out. And usually they would just take my arm. Like, of course, big American clowns come and walk me to my seat all the time. That's what we do. But that would be my person I would hold in my mind and in my heart for the show.
During the course of the show. Interesting.
Exactly. So I'm looking out in the dark and I see her in my head.
The reason why I'm asking the question is the parallels that you could take from that experience to a corporate audience. And do you have any guidance that you would have? Because we go into different groups. We're presenting, facilitating, speaking with. And the biggest challenge is their state, the way that they engage with us. Yeah. What guidance do you have for a business person, an executive engaging with an audience that may be difficult?
Well, I think you really hit the crux here, which is that in a lot of business settings, the person in front who's presenting may be giving a general presentation the same one they gave yesterday, and unfortunately it feels that way.
Right.
Sometimes you've probably been in these meetings where before it officially starts, everyone's connected and joking. And then, and the person who's leading says, oh, that's great. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get this meeting started. So and their voice changes and the air just gets sucked out of the room because we've now gotten serious, but not serious as in we've got serious business, which you can do as humans to humans, as we got to be serious because that's what business sounds like, which is not engaging. You asked specifically, the things that someone can do are, one, never talk to an audience. Like, even when I'm playing for 3,200 people, if I'm performing to 3,200 people, it's too general and amorphous. I'm performing to that person right there.
The lady that you went out and gave your arm to.
Exactly. Yep. And this person over here who wore a wig to the show for some reason. And it's specific. And in a business setting, if you're looking at one person and making a connection with one person, it will change who you are. It will warm up the room, as we say. We also call it shrinking the room, making it more intimate. The other is something I recommend all the time, which is before a meeting, especially if it's high stakes, warm up your heart by talking to people. If you can talk to the people who are going to be in the audience to break down it's them and me, that's wonderful. If not, anybody. There are maintenance folks and stagehands backstage across the world who've wondered why this large clown came up and chatted with them and was so interested in their lives. It's because I use that as I want to make sure I'm already in dialogue before I get out there and get the mistaken egotistical idea that it's all about me. Right. It's not.
You know what? I want to pick up on the comment that you made about meetings, because I see this all the time where it's like, before the meeting, I always say it's like we're talking like humans, right?
Yeah.
And then we go into this mode of like speaking like business people.
Yes, exactly.
And one of the things that I try to do oftentimes is, once again, maybe this goes back to kind of keeping it light and actually having real conversations with people versus going into that, business speak that quite frankly, nobody likes it. It's just we've been conditioned over the years to act like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the Clown Conservatory. That was actually a pretty significant part of your career.
Yeah.
What was behind finding that? And I guess for those of us that may not know what a Clown Conservatory is, what is it?
I'll answer the second question first. It's a training program for professional clowns.
Okay. But there was something special about the one you founded, right?
It was better than any others.
It was better than every. But wasn't it also more open, or it was more cost effective? Was there something to it?
There were a few things, hopefully, to it.
Yeah.
One, it was the only one in the country.
Well, that makes it unique.
There was no in-depth. This was a 1 to 2 year program.
Okay.
We invited students to a second year. So there was nothing like that, and still isn't.
And still is, yeah.
The Clown Conservatory is still going, but there's not another one. So that made it unique. Yes, we managed to keep the cost very low and gave a lot of scholarships, work study, and we tried to make those work study scholarships where they're performing or teaching. So
they're almost paying it off as they go.
And they're getting the experience that they need to get, almost like an internship.
Yep.
We also, you may be referring in terms of being open. So we're training professional clowns. I had 136 students go through the school in the 10 years I was there. And I just saw a couple of them last night. Some of them are the biggest names in circus around the world. They've been very, very successful. And some of them are not in the business at all, but they still use their clown training. And going into it, my partner Peggy Ford and I were really clear we were not looking for in the auditions for the people who someone might say has talent.
Okay.
We were looking for people who had 3 attributes. One, who we wanted to spend 2 years with, who were accessible, whose hearts were accessible, who made that kind of connection we were just talking about and didn't feel like a cardboard cutout or whatever the business equivalent of clowning. They could really connect. And the third is that they could work and take notes and have discipline.
Otherwise, they wouldn't make it through the 2 years.
You're not going to.
Right.
The profession is an on-time profession. You are never late. The profession is all about a lot of discipline and a lot of hard travel and being able to get off of a bus after 12 hours and do a great children's show because that's what's in front of you. So that was necessary, the physical stamina. So we were looking for that. So that meant we took some students who had no stage experience. My favorite is someone who came to the audition and said, I'm a psychic healer, and I really don't know why I'm here, but after healing once, a voice came to me, and I know who it is, but I can't tell you. But a voice came to me and said, go to clown school. And Peggy and I, my partner, my business partner and I had a look at each other, but we accepted her, and she was fabulous. And she did not go into the profession. She stayed for 2 years. She was good. She was at a professional level. She went back into her body work and her business of psychic healing. And she now offers, and this is not made up, she offers a clown massage where she's built in an electronic whoopee cushion under the massage table. So she'll turn.
So you don't know when it's coming?
You don't know when it's coming. She's working on you, and then she'll push the button and go, whoa!
See, I love where this conversation's going. Okay, so we have her example. What if they didn't go into being a clown, what else did some of your students do? Like, where are they now?
Some are teachers.
Okay.
One of them is getting her PhD in physics. One of them, and this is one of my favorites, who had all the skills to be a professional. As a matter of fact, teamed up with someone else, another student, and had an act that already could have gone to circus competitions and won.
Yep.
But he chose not to. I was always on him because he was a gamer, and he was always coming in with those big bags under his eyes because he'd been up. Well, he went into big data research, and now he works for a firm that mines big data to try to find human trafficking. And very proudly, when I saw him a few years ago, they'd arrested 12 people based on his research. And they said, okay, you are not using your training at all. I love what you're doing, but you're not using your training. He goes, are you kidding? I use it all the time. See, because they send me back to D.C. when we have to go talk to the FBI, because I'm the only person who can talk to the big data folks and the FBI because I got clown training.
You got to love that.
I love that.
You made a huge, well, maybe in your mind it's not a huge pivot, but to me it seemed like a huge pivot going from all of your acting, Cirque du Soleil, running this clown school, and then you moved to Stand and Deliver, where you're basically coaching people like me. That's how we got to know each other. What was behind that pivot in your career? It
was a big pivot.
Okay, good.
It felt every bit as big to me as to you.
Yep. Okay.
But maybe for surprising things, I went almost right off the road with Cirque du Soleil. As a matter of fact, it was an email I sent when one of my faculty members in the school. I was running my school from the road when I was performing with Cirque du Soleil, and I was in Japan. And one of my faculty members blew it, and they sent an email to the students when they were supposed to go to the faculty, and it was
not a nice email.
It was not a nice email, and it was this could close your school kind of email. So from Japan, in the middle of the night, I framed up an email to send back. One of the people in my faculty, William Hall, also was working with Stand and Deliver and doing a lot of work in organizations. He took that email and took it to Peter Myers, who runs Stand and Deliver still, and said, you want this person because he can communicate even from Japan. And so I really did go right off the road to start off the road with Cirque du Soleil, touring in a tent, 10 shows a week, to working in boardrooms. And I say it that way because that's where it felt particularly weird. I just wasn't used to being in rooms like we're in now. I wasn't used to wearing what I'm wearing now, which is a
You're dressed nicer than I am. You're wearing a sport coat and I'm not.
Thank you. That was on purpose. I wanted the audience to see that.
Yep.
But there was a real identity crisis, an identity shift there that took a lot of work. And my colleagues helped me with that work. One of the things by saying, you're good at this, they're saying to me, you're good at this, you're using all your skills as a teacher and a performer, and that's needed. You're teaching and you're performing, you're in front of the room, you're performing, and then you're trying to share skills teaching. But it doesn't feel like you're all here. And I had to realize, because I don't feel comfortable here yet. When I made that shift and said, oh, yeah, I need to be here, it changed.
Can you go back to the email? Because I've known you mostly in verbal communications, quite frankly. What did you, and you don't need to get into the specific language of the email, But we communicate, unfortunately, a lot through email. There's oftentimes a lot that is said in an email or unsaid in an email that creates a lot of issues. What did you do in that email that was so impactful that Peter would read it and say, we gotta hire him?
Well, I'm not sure that email did all the work. Peter was looking to hire somebody else. We knew each other.
But it did something,
it did
right?
Something.
Yes.
So I had to use an email because I was in Japan and I was doing 2 shows a day. So there was no possible way that I could talk live.
Sure.
Even though this is clearly a talk live type of incident.
Yep.
So I framed it in a way. I said, what you got, students, was the way we talk to each other in faculty meetings. We talk tough about you because we want you to be great.
So you kind of owned it up front.
Absolutely.
Yep.
You want that. You want us to talk about you. Oftentimes, I will defend one of you from a comment like this, specifically from that teacher, because I'll give a context of what I've asked you to do, which is not comfortable for you. And I'll accuse the faculty of you're judging a product, not a process, and we'll have this fight in private. You got a glimpse of what we do to try to make you great behind the scenes.
I'm going to actually restate it. You didn't just own it. You actually helped them understand why you communicate to each other in that manner. Yeah. So you actually didn't run away and try to defend yourself. No. You actually took them through the rationale for why we speak like that behind the scenes, which I think is actually pretty powerful.
I had to ask myself, wait, because I got the email and I liked it. I laughed. He's a funny guy. And so I said, why is it okay to be among the faculty when it's not okay to go to the students? Is that wrong?
Right.
And then I thought, no, it isn't wrong. They shouldn't hear us. They're fragile. They're students. But we have to be able to talk real about them in order to teach them. So I had to think through the real process and say, this is a legitimate process. It's not that we've set something up that we shouldn't have set up. We just should send it to the right people.
But there's something so powerful, not necessarily in sending the email in the first place, but the way that you responded. And what's powerful to me is that oftentimes leaders will just say sorry. Mm-hmm. And that's not what you did.
No.
You said, there is a reason why we communicate. Let us bring you into our world and help you understand. Yes, in a perfect world, you probably should not have seen this for these reasons, but this is why we speak the way we speak. I think that's powerful.
Yeah, it worked. It actually worked too well. When I got home for a break, everyone was mad at me, and they loved the teacher who had sent that because he gives us the real stuff. He's tough. Jeff, you're such a... But believe me, so much better to have it that way, because it actually did set us up now for, if they got tough criticism, it was now they had framed it as the stuff they wanted.
Right. It actually gave you the opportunity now to be totally transparent with them in the future.
Yeah.
So maybe just 30 seconds, because we're going to hit kind of what you do with Stand and Deliver in a lot more detail later on in the conversation. But just for whoever's listening to this, what is Stand and Deliver and what do you do now today?
So Stand and Deliver is a boutique communications consulting firm. That's the framework. It's not so boutique anymore because there's about 60
bigger.
of us.
Yep.
We mainly are folks from a theatrical background, like I am, and we work on the real high level of communication. How do you make things like the meetings you were talking about? What's the tactical part of making a human-to-human meeting? How do you stand in front of a group and really influence them physically? What we were talking about at the beginning. Right. How do you use your body? How do you use your voice? Not get into the business speak. How can you tell stories that are authentic in a business setting? How can you scale that to a virtual setting? Because a lot of meetings happen virtually. So we've done a lot of exploration on how do you scale that into the ways that people are actually communicating.
And more are moving. I just got off of a video conference with people all around the world.
Yes.
So Secret Life of Clowns and The Snow Clown. You wrote 2 books in the last, 5-6 years, right?
Yes.
What was one high and one low of writing those books?
I like that question. The high for my first book, The Secret Life of Clowns, was when I finally got the key idea of how to write it. It was actually 2 books beforehand. One was from my journal from being on the road with Cirque du Soleil.
Yep.
I knew it was an interesting seen.
There
So
was
I wrote a
something
journal,
there, yep.
and I tried to turn it into a book, and it was so boring. And the other was my school, the Clown Conservatory. I really wanted to tell the story of how we had interesting students. It was an interesting story. And then one day I realized I could tell the school one from the point of view of a student, and I could tell the Cirque du Soleil one from the point of view of that student's teacher who's trying to do what he teaches on the road for thousands of people every day. And I could mix those together.
Was that serendipitous? Because oftentimes you'll hear an author go through the process of figuring out what the book is about. Did you just stumble into that, or do you?
7 years later.
7 years. Would you do anything differently as a result of that insight, or maybe you just need to go through that process to kind of coalesce these things together?
For that book, I didn't need it because I didn't know how to write a book. I've written 17 plays.
Yeah.
I know how to write a play, but I didn't know how to write a book. So I did have to go through and stumble and stumble and stumble.
But do you think you would still need to stumble and stumble and stumble?
Well, on the second book, I shaved, the first one took me really 10 years, and the second one I shaved 9 years off that
there
process.
you go.
I felt very
so
good
you're
about
90% more efficient, or actually probably better than that. I don't know.
that. I'm not going with the numbers.
I'm
on
not
that.
going. Actually, I think I
But
botched that.
I'll tell you a low point
Yep.
was when I realized that the book, this thing that you hold in your hand that has your name on it, and that's so cool, isn't the product, isn't the thing. It doesn't do anything.
Right.
It's only as you interact with people around it and people read it. And unless you're a big bestseller, which I'm not, it's really about when I show up and read from it and have conversations. And I love that now, but at that moment I was so tired from writing. I said, "You're kidding me."
I did all of this for that,
and
yeah.
it's not a thing.
But you know what? I think it's the journey, quite frankly, you went on, right? And then you are in a position to share all these stories and perspectives, because you would not have gone on that journey had you not, or you would have not come to those conclusions had you not gone into that journey that you just went through.
Very true.
I don't know if that was that articulate, but whatever. Okay, so let's move on. Oh, actually, I do have one last question about the books. How's it helped you as a professional?
In ways that surprised me. One thing, one of our mutual friends, Chris Ertel, read The Secret Life of Clowns and said, "This is a wonderful learning and development manual." And I said, "No, it's not. It's a book on clowns." So the fact that other people read it and look through their own lens is very satisfying to me, and it sparks conversations. And the second book, The Snow Clown, is also autofiction or autobiographical fiction. It's fiction taken from my life. And a lot of that is about cross-cultural communication and the problems of it and possible solutions. And that has opened up a world that I had been pretty nervous about getting into, which is looking at cross-cultural communications, which is it's big. There's lots of global
Even after
teams.
your time in Japan with Cirque du Soleil, still, yeah.
But it felt very different to
yeah.
me. But the process of digesting in the Snow Clown, I'm talking about trips to Eskimo villages in Alaska, which I did when I was earlier in my career, and then my time in Nebraska, which for someone from Berkeley feels as far away as Alaska. And I was an artist in residence in a diversity program, because being Jewish makes you very diverse in many parts of Nebraska. So those were old experiences, decades ago, but digesting them, as you suggested, into the book made them both accessible to other people. I could talk with people about it. I could hear their stories, and so I grew, but also to me.
So, Jeff, we're going to pivot. First of all, unbelievable backstory and all the incredible things that you've done. Quite frankly, I think we could have sat here for about 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours talking about all this. So I would encourage anybody, if you want to go learn more about Jeff, go read one of his books, go look online. Incredible backstory. But we are here to talk about the world that I live in. So, we practice risk management. And when I think about the things that you've done, acrobatics, you talked about that was really your entry in many respects into the circus.
Yeah.
That's a high risk activity, right? And I'm curious, what do you think acrobatics can teach us about risk? But maybe just let's start with how you think about acrobatics. And there's the base, there's the flyer, and then there's a spotter. And each of them, when we were talking before the interview, have very defined roles. Can you maybe talk a bit about that? And then we could see if we could draw some parallels.
Absolutely. So let me define those roles. The base is the person, let's say someone's going to stand on someone's shoulders, what they call a two high. So the base would be me. I'm standing underneath.
You're a big dude.
And the flyers, the person's going to be standing on my shoulders. And the spotters, the person's going to keep us safe.
Yep.
And when I started teaching acrobatics, I realized I had to find a way to tell each of those three people what their job is in a nice condensed way. And what I came up with is that the base is the realist. The base has to look at the flyer, look them in the eyes, know their tendencies, see if they've slept well, all those things, so that you can make your flyer look perfect by little adjustments, weight, all these different physical things you can do. The flyer has to be an optimist. Everything is fine. I'm going to step up there and stand there, and no matter what,
nothing's going to go wrong.
Nothing's going to go wrong, because if they have the doubts, they're actually going to end up hurting the base, because they're going to pull back a little, and instead of the foot going all the way up to the shoulder, it'll kick you in the neck and all these things. So it's a very physical issue. Be a full optimist, and there's all kinds of techniques that a base will use to make sure that their flyer doesn't see things and get into, like, I did a move with a partner for a long time where she essentially jumped up on me, had one foot on my leg and the other behind my neck. And on a bad day, she'd kick me in the back of the neck from the ground and I'd black out. But I was still standing, but the world would go into negative and then positive. And I knew to just stand there, and you would be crazy to tell her, because the next time she'd be careful, and then she'd kick me lower in the back and fall. So I had to have her feel absolutely comfortable every time. So that's that relationship.
Yep.
But then the third is the spotter, and in some ways that might be the one that's most interesting in this conversation of risk. And they have to be the pessimist. They have to be a real good pessimist, not a general, oh no. They have to look and say, last time they went up, leaning a little bit back, which means I need to position myself 3/4 back here. They have to never stand directly behind them so that they get hurt too.
Right.
You stand to the side. They can never stand directly behind the person climbing on shoulders, because if they fall, they'll both get hurt. They have to remember the technique of the trick, and then they have to know the specifics of these two human beings doing this trick. And they're often also the trainer. And I think this is where it gets to be an interesting parallel with someone in risk in an organization.
Absolutely. What's interesting is, as you were going through this, I was thinking about how does this actually apply in an organization? And I actually would argue the flyer is actually critical, because part of the challenge with risk management, everybody always thinks that risk management, like the profession, is all about holding the organization back, right? But I think we know that in every organization, in order to grow, you have to take risks.
Yes,
and you need to take risks, not blindly, but you need to have confidence when you take those risks. And so I think the flyer is maybe analogous to, the CEO, let's just say. Uh-huh. And then the base, I think, is also another critical role. To me, I think there's a part of ambivalence, meaning they don't have a point of view. I'd have to think a bit more about what their linkage would be. But the spotter is kind of that risk management person. And one of the things that we've talked about, especially when you think about strategic decision making, which is fraught with risk, that individual, to a certain degree, I love using the devil's advocate metaphor, in that I probably have talked about this on the podcast before, but and maybe since you've come back from a Jewish background, maybe this isn't as clear, but the Pope would actually, back in the day, I think this was, they stopped doing this in the 50s, but when somebody was going to be canonized as a saint, they would actually hire a lawyer to argue why they shouldn't be a saint. So they played the devil's advocate. Yes. And so what you're essentially saying is that spotter is looking up to say, what is going to go wrong? And what I would say is, in an organization, it's actually healthy to create that tension for somebody to say, yes, we should potentially look at this, but here are all the things that could go wrong. And let's make sure that we're doing everything we can to manage that risk. Mm-hmm. And what I also love about this story, just as an aside, it's actually a beautiful way to talk about risk management using the power of story, which we'll talk a bit more about later, or kind of a metaphor that one could use. So
when you said that the flyer is the most important, it struck me. It should have struck me a long time ago, but it struck me that the only reason that the spotter is there is so the flyer can go higher.
That's a great point. It's like brakes on a car.
Right. You don't have a spotter for tricks you already know. You only bring the spotter in when you're trying to do something new and higher or wilder or longer.
Let's keep with this acrobatic because I love this. And this may sound like a trivial question, but I think there's more to it. What role does practice play? So like you're there, right? You're not just going to go wing it on your first performance, right? Can you talk about the level of practice that is necessary in order to hone your craft, but also is there a risk of too much practice?
Yes, on all of those. Obviously, you got to learn your trick.
Right.
To perform a trick, you have to be what they call, we used to call it, you're over the trick or you're beyond the trick. That is, you're not thinking of the specifics of the trick. Now, the truth is most of us, when we go on stage, like I used to do an act where I had a 15-foot metal pole on my shoulder and my partner climbed up and we did a whole act with her climbing up and down the pole. We opened that. We were not above the trick. You know what I mean? There's all we could do is focus on that. But the director came to me and said, I think we're going to have to cut that act.
Why do you say that?
You got to be out of your mind. You can't correct that. No, she said, well, because the whole rest of the show, and this was towards the end of the show, it was a big finale, and my partner and I were the main clowns. I said, for the rest of the show, you're connected with us, we know who you are, and then all of a sudden you turn into these acrobats that we don't know because you're so focused. She wasn't going to cut the trick, I don't think, but she was hinting, you have to practice enough so this trick is only part of it, that you're still connected with the audience, and you're still connected. You're not just going, where's the weight going? Technique, technique, technique.
It's interesting. I'm trying to think about that because what you're saying is the practice wasn't enough just to do the trick without having somebody hurt themselves.
Correct.
It was that we actually had to be in a state that was consistent with the broader performance.
Well put. I wish you'd have been there when I heard that because I went through days of turmoil. The other thing you had said
risk of overtraining.
Is risk of overtraining. And that is real. And we're not just talking about injury from overtraining. There is a kind of sweet spot of training, and there's a lot of training, especially when you're learning a trick. But then there's the maintenance of something, and a lot of people, especially who come from sports into the circus, will overtrain. Because in sports, you train, have a meet, train. In circus, you perform, have a little break, try to recover, perform. So where you get the training in. And different cultures have, like the Russians I've worked with, had a habit of you train a new trick in the afternoon, well before the show. You take a break, you take a nap, you eat a little bit, and then right before the show, stretch out and go do your work. So that training earlier in the day serves as the warm-up and the new work.
That's interesting. I mean, it's almost like when I tackle work in the morning or when I tackle work in the day, if I've got hard stuff, I think it's obviously because cognitively I'm much better early in the morning. So it's probably the same principle.
Yes. But different cultures have it differently, and there's sometimes problems with that.
So let's talk about biases. We all have biases. Do you think, and the reason why I raise this is we believe at Deloitte, and I think we see this play out over and over, is a lot of times risks that ultimately manifest themselves is because of biases that an organization or an executive would have. Something like overconfidence, like, oh, there is no way that this strategy is not going to perform like I think it should because, I'm good, or I'm actually anchoring it on past events, which we all know that some of those biases are the things that have created real risk and even crises for organizations. Yeah. Do biases come in the theater and create potentially unforeseen risks as well?
I'm sure the answer is yes. And some of the other things we talked about are more immediately apparent. Here's what comes to mind with that is when you're an acrobat, you iterate. You go over and over. That's what rehearsal is, iterating. And as a clown, a circus performer, you want to get out there in front of an audience a lot. So that's how we mitigate that kind of risk, the risk of a bias of overconfidence,
right,
or a bias that my sense of humor is everyone's sense of humor,
right,
which is a dangerous bias.
Right.
So by getting in front of different audiences and my students, I would always make sure to take one act and I bring people in and have them try it there. I did a solo show about the Holocaust, and it had a lot of tough scenes, but one scene could have been offensive to someone who was a survivor. But I needed that scene, but I wasn't going to offend survivors. So I took just that scene, a little 10-minute piece of it, around to a couple of Jewish community centers and performed it for survivors with the question, I will cut this scene if you tell me to. Let's try it. And luckily they said, that is a tough scene for me to watch and you need to say it.
Do you know what's fascinating? I literally was thinking 30 seconds ago, I wonder if this question that I ask is really relevant or if we could draw parallels. I'm so glad I didn't stop you. And the reason being is what you just said is you went out and you actually tested your bias. And you actually got input from people in a safe way. Like you were open. If they disagreed and they didn't think you should have that scene in, you would have cut it.
I would have cut it. Yeah.
I like that.
My test audience was very specific, survivors, because I had a younger man who was working with a woman who was a survivor, an older survivor, say, you have to cut that. And she turned around and said, oh, be quiet. You don't need to cut it. I hate that scene, but you don't need to cut it. You need to speak because it can't be my history. It has to be yours. Now she had a whole rap. But she, I had to know who my audience was. It was only her.
I'm guessing, and I'm not a performer. I have absolutely no talent whatsoever. But I'm guessing you need to continue to take risks. Like whatever your performance is today, it's probably going to need to be better, especially as you're designing plays or musicals or, circus acts. You always got to keep kind of ratcheting it up, doing something better, bigger, more interesting, possibly. The question I have is, you have to take risks.
You do. Absolutely.
How do you take those risks, but then manage it so that you don't get somebody hurt or you don't do something that is creating too much risk for the performers, quite frankly?
So there's different kinds of risk here. There's theatrical risk, emotional risk. There's physical risk.
Right.
The way that you get the physical risk greater and greater is you make sure that you have a great rigging crew. Because a lot of injuries happen when something goes wrong in the rigging. You also have to recognize that there is risk in doing the same thing over and over and not going high. Right. Yep. A lot of injuries are either repetitive motion injuries because you're doing the same thing or a space out moment where you've done this particular move so many times it's not safe. And it's usually around spotting equipment, actually, safety equipment. You have to put this belt on a certain way to be safe, and you've done it 1,000 times, and you just miss the Velcro, and you fall. Or
it's almost like you've developed that habit so much that you're not thinking about it, and then you make a mistake. And then if you actually push yourself a little, you're more focused because you're learning a new trick, and so you're more focused.
Exactly. And theatrically, what I always do, like I did 500 shows of exactly the same of Corteo. Okay, so the first 375 were in English and the last ones were in Japanese, but it was the same show. So every show I felt at risk of becoming a hack. Every show I felt at risk of phoning it in, some version of that.
So what would you do to manage that risk?
First, I would remember that my students might be watching. And if they see me not doing what I teach them, I lose all credibility.
But that would literally change your state then in that moment, right? Because you're now thinking, okay, somebody's out there, and it would get you to focus on
exactly. Okay. And then I would choose a particular moment. Every show, I would choose a particular moment and try to upgrade it. Now, I did not have. This is 60 people in the cast.
Right.
By upgrading, I'm not even improvising or freelancing or something that anyone else might even notice. I'm not changing something. I'm just saying, if I can put my mind on this moment and try to change. Let me give you a little example of this. My director, Richard Desjardins, was at Corteo, was a ballet dancer. And we had a wonderful agreement between the two of us, which is he would give me notes. and I would try them the next show, even if I thought they were insane. But I'd try them.
Why?
Because he allowed me on the back end to come back and say, Richard, that didn't work. And he was absolutely fine about, we'll try it. And I found about half of the notes, which is a pretty good score for someone who's...
So you're basically taking your game to the next level half the time.
Exactly.
Right.
And one of them was a scene that I hated and subsequently was really bad at. And I couldn't figure it out from my acting point of view, from my clown point of view. And one day I'm stretching and Richard comes over and says, think like a dancer for the marionette scene. And before I get to say, what do you mean by that? He's walking away because he wanted it to marinate in my head. And so I had about an hour before the show. I'm thinking everything I know about dancing. Okay, I've taken a lot of dance classes, thinking these certain ways, and it helped so much. No one could tell it was different except my partner, who was this acrobat, came up afterwards and said, Jeff, that was the best you have done. It was good. We were connected. And I thought, thank you, Richard. And so that got it going.
In those 50% where you're like, oh, that did not go over well, do you think the audience noticed?
Hopefully not, because we took small things on. But sometimes they might. That's a good thing about having 10 shows a week.
You could keep getting better. But here's the reason why I ask, and this is not about like taking big strategic risks as an organization. It's almost like taking, which I don't even really think are big risks per se, but doing things differently as a professional on a daily basis. And what I'm hearing you say is you would get a number of recommendations from your boss, basically, right?
Exactly.
And you would try them.
Yes.
And some of them would like take your craft to the next level.
Yep.
Some of them wouldn't go that well. But it doesn't sound like the ones that didn't go well hurt you in a material way. But it sounds like the stuff that went well actually, in a cumulative effect, probably took your show to the next level.
Absolutely. And the fact that we came from very different backgrounds helped that.
Right.
Some of his notes, like that one, Think Like a Dancer, it really took me an hour to figure out what is he even talking about.
Right.
But he was crafty enough to move away and not let me ask him those questions. Other notes, he just didn't understand clowning, and I would try it, and it just wasn't funny. So we'd lose a laugh.
Right.
Which isn't a big deal. It's a big deal, though, if you hold on to it internally. And I think that's on the back end of risk. What do you do after having taken the risk? And in this case, it doesn't work. You can go back and say, Richard, I'm never listening to you again. Because I went out and I lost a laugh. And I loved that laugh.
Right.
Which was true. I wanted to say that many times. That's not right. I tried what you said. What did you think? And he goes, it wasn't that funny. Thanks.
But even you don't need a Richard. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make, is that every day we are confronted with opportunities to quote unquote do something different or take a risk, right? Yeah. And I think what your story is bringing to life is some of them are going to go really well and some of them aren't going to go so well. But in the end, the ones that didn't go that well weren't that big of a deal, but the ones that did go well actually took you to the next level. So net, had you not done any of them, you would not have advanced.
No,
and maybe you would have regressed to a certain degree.
There's no doubt about it. There are bitter clowns in the world, people who are just bitter about having to go out and make people laugh all the time. And that is not, it's a slippery slope. You get tired, you're doing these shows, the audience isn't good, you start talking that way instead of, I didn't do well, the audience isn't good. And it's true that Richard helped me stay there and I helped myself stay there. I just want to put a plug in for having that outside eye. And I'll give you an example. An ex-student of mine who is now one of the top clowns in the world, I saw a show he did last night with a very mixed group. Some were very top performers and some were pretty new performers. Right. And it was their preview. I was in the audience and they didn't get a lot of laughs. And I get an email from him today and he was never like, I didn't get the laughs. I felt like it was a little off. Because you're human, and you care. You better care. You don't put that work in without caring. So it allowed me to send an email saying, here's what I saw happen. You moved beautifully. You connected with the audience right away, and you and your partner aren't quite in sync yet. The rest of the cast was a little jittery at the top. The timing was off. It was their first show, and they didn't connect with the audience. And I think that's why you didn't hear the laughs. Hopefully, tonight, he'll go into rehearsal and he'll go into his prep with a little so it's not just free floating.
Right.
Oh, it was terrible. He has some ideas of what he can work on. I think that's where an outside eye can help.
Well, and that gets into resilience. So
yes,
how important, I'm guessing resilience in the theater or in the circus is paramount, right?
Yes.
How do you I don't even know if you could teach resilience, but how do you cultivate resilience in performers, or can you?
So resilience has two different meanings in this case. One is not the meaning you were meant. I'll address that in a moment. For clowns, resilience is a core. We didn't even get to talk about this earlier, but it's a core idea, which is when an audience is watching and a clown falls down, they know they're going to pop back up.
Right.
If they fall down,
but that's part of
don't.
the act a lot of times, right?
So it's
the expectation.
Both is happening at once.
Yep.
You can have a slap and a fall that looks absolutely accurate, and the audience goes, "Oh!"
Yeah.
And at the same time, they know that clown's going to do a little kip up and stand back up and be resilient. So, and if they're not, something has gone horribly wrong.
Right.
So that it's a character trait of resilience.
Right.
But you were talking about the resilience of the work, of getting yourself through the work.
Yeah, I mean, it's we were talking about small risks.
Yeah.
That don't have major ramifications, but there are things that go really bad, right?
Yeah.
Things that potentially could ruin a performer's career. So I guess what I'm getting to is, because resilience is extremely important in the corporate world.
Yes.
The ability when a crisis hits or when things get difficult to manage through that. And so what I'm trying to draw a parallel from your world is how do you teach or how do you cultivate resilience in a performer, especially when knowing that things are going to go wrong?
And absolutely things go wrong and careers do get ended. Again, this is one that I have to think through a little more. The thoughts that came to mind were when I was running my school, the students did a performance every 5 weeks. And that was to build resilience and for me to learn who they were in front of an audience.
So they had to practice, is what you're getting at. Yeah.
It also was a subtle thing where the audience, they wouldn't listen to me. But when the audience didn't laugh, they would listen to the audience.
It's like my kids. Yeah, I got it. Yep.
So there's nothing worse than going in front of an audience with something you thought was brilliant and it dies. It's very different from your teacher saying, that's not going to work tomorrow.
You actually bring up a really important point. It's the difference between you could practice for a crisis, right? As a corporate organization. Yes. But going through one that's real is the best test.
Yes.
And not that you ever wish a crisis upon an organization, but it is going to happen.
Yes.
And I think what's key is putting those individuals that you believe should be leading through a crisis to a test.
Yeah.
And seeing how they perform. And that's essentially what you're saying you would do with your performers.
And then it's really crucial to debrief on the back end.
Right.
Because you can really learn the wrong lessons in a crisis setting. I would always, after the show, have a circle, and I would ask each person to say something that they did that worked in the show. And sometimes someone couldn't think of it. I dropped the juggling balls. I was off time on the dance. I says, no, I actually asked something that worked. Nothing worked. Can anyone help them say something that worked? Well, you got me my prop on time. Thank you. He's great. But that was important to go through and get what we learned in the right way, what we learned to do, and then, okay, we're going to throw 90% of this out. Let's talk about that.
See, I think resilient attributes sometimes are kind of nature. So when you were going through the process, you talked earlier about in the clown conservatory, when you would look at prospective students, you'd pick certain people that just didn't feel like they fit the bill. Would you look, and obviously you probably weren't thinking about it at the time, like, are these individuals resilient? But would you see those characteristics that, they were a fighter, they're somebody that when, push comes to shove, they would bounce back, they would work hard, they would keep coming back? Was that a consideration? It doesn't need to be, I'm just curious.
I don't think it was at that point. However, we never kicked anyone out of the school because they weren't funny or they weren't good on stage. We would keep you for the whole year, even if you were terrible on stage. What you would get kicked out of the school very quickly for was not being on time to every single class every day. There was only 3 choices. The first time you're late, you have a written contract. The second time you're late, you have another written contract, and it says, if you're going to be late, don't come, and we're keeping your tuition. So because that's the nature of it, and that also says commitment and resilience. Wow. And if you were not working in the classes, if I dropped in on the class, or because we had acrobatics, dance, mime, lots of classes, and if you were checking out on any of those, we'd have a discussion. And I think that has something to do with resilience.
It does.
You've got to be able, because everybody was terrible in at least one class. Just by the nature of the variety of classes,
you can't be great at everyone.
You're not great in everyone. And if you're great in all of them, you have the even worse thing of arrogance that could come in and stop working. And that we pushed that. And then they went on tour. For the last 2 weeks of school, they were on tour where they had to manage the entire tour through schools and senior centers through the entire Bay Area without losing a prop. There was none of this, oh, can we drive back? No, you do the act without your prop. So we had all the things about how you pack and load and work with your clients, the school, all of these things. And that builds the resilience of the life, the actual work that's not on stage.
I actually feel like I could be a clown now because I have no talent, but I think I could show up on time and work hard. How's that?
I don't actually believe in talent, and I know that a lot of talent scouts would wonder what that means. I really don't believe in it. I do believe people have certain propensities. They're better, but that's not always what's going to shine. And I hold on to that because I was a terrible student at theater school.
So let's move to mistakes. So you have written, I think it was maybe a LinkedIn post or something where you say, mistakes are your friend. And I totally agree. And I'm not saying this in a negative way. It's kind of a cliche, right?
It is.
I think part of the challenge is how do you reframe a mistake, not after the fact, like a month or two, and say, oh, I learned something great from it. How do you reframe it in the moment? Or can you? Have you figured out a way to reframe it to be something positive?
Yes. I got a few thoughts on that.
Yep.
One is the thing we were talking about earlier of when it happens, your mind doesn't go into the cycle of, oh, that's terrible, but goes into the cycle of here's an opportunity. And that's an improviser's way of thinking. I don't know what's happening next. Great. Something exciting is going to happen rather than, I don't know what's happening next. I'm screwed. The other is to not try. A lot of people, when a mistake happens, they take their internal monologue and they start saying it. Oh, the slide's not coming up. That's terrible. Okay, we're going to, I'm sorry about that. I was thinking about the slide, but without it here, I actually don't, that's my internal monologue. And all that's doing is telling the audience, boy, I don't know what I'm doing here when I don't have all my stuff and I'm really insecure. Don't do that. You just get quiet. The slide didn't come up. And then a simple statement, it looks like we don't have the slides. And that's a clown technique, by the way. You just, like if a baby cries, you stop and you look at the baby. And you get this big laugh. You've done nothing. You've just said, what's happening is really happening. So the slide just left. Should we keep going without slides? Great. Boom. Make something, and always on a mistake going for connection. Mistakes are the little rip that allows you to connect.
Well, I think a few things I want to touch on. Can you go back to the notion of it's almost like improv? And what you're saying is when something happens, you don't let that inner voice tell you what went wrong. You actually aren't even thinking about it other than here's the facts. I now need to take a next step. Yeah. Maybe, I don't know if there's
And anything. In improv, it's the next simple step. Ooh. A lot of people watch very clever, funny improvisers and think that they're clever and trying to make jokes. That's the worst thing to do when you're improvising. The real laughs in improvisation are the same as the real laughs in the real world. They don't come from a joke usually. They come from a surprise or a connection. So in improvisation, if you come in and say, Ed, there's a gorilla after me, and I find a clever joke about a gorilla, it doesn't help. What helps is this idea of yes and, which has now entered the business world. Yes, and he's after me too.
Right.
Simple. There was nothing clever about that, but it allows you and me to go run across the stage from the gorilla.
But what's beautiful about that is I think the reason why a lot of times people freeze in the moment is because they're not thinking about that next thing. They're thinking about the broader strategy. Slides went down. How am I going to manage this for the next 15 minutes?
Exactly right.
What am I going to do?
Yes.
The other thing I think it brings up is if you weren't well prepared, not over prepared, but well prepared, it would be very difficult, I think, in the moment to really carry that 15 minutes.
Yeah. I actually don't believe in over-prepared. I think in
You don't?
I think
Okay.
about misprepared. I go back to the clown school for the analogy. I did have some students who come in and say, "Oh man, I'm so glad I'm here in clown school, man, because I love to improvise because I don't like rehearse stuff. And clowning's all about in the moment." And I said, that's great. You're in the wrong place, because we actually practice so much that you can be in the moment.
A lot of times when people are presenting, we just keep going back to this PowerPoint, they're relying on the PowerPoint to drive the conversation.
Yes.
When in fact, what you're saying is, if you're so well prepared, it really, quite frankly, doesn't matter if the PowerPoint's not there, because you've prepared, you know what to say. And actually your presentation may be better.
Yes. If your PowerPoint is doing its job, which is to give a visual support to your words.
Yep.
When you've lost the visual support, you might have to draw a picture with your words. So what I'm talking about, imagine a graph and the three ideas that we're talking about, the one, and you just start to show it with your hands, and then beautiful.
And then you go.
If you just think of it that way, if your slides are not doing their job right, which is it's actually the slides presentation and you're along for the ride, well, you got a problem on both ends.
So we talked earlier in your stand and deliver role, but really where you're spending your career now is helping people like me communicate more effectively, present better, be more persuasive, all that good stuff. And you're a master at it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. But I'm curious, because we've had this conversation before. Internally people will say, well, what is an actor going to teach me about business communication? Can you just touch on why you think the world that you've come from is so beneficial? And it's not necessarily about you. It's about the profession that you're in and how it can be so valuable to us as business people.
So the most obvious thing in terms of acting is standing in front of the room.
Right.
And when you're presenting. So if I'm working with an organization that's, say, an insurance company, I'm using the language of insurance and I'm using the language of that company, which is like my script.
Right.
But I have to be authentically myself.
Right.
And that's the same challenge as the people I'm working with have. And that's what I'm teaching. So that seems very clear cut. The things that have surprised me.
That's what I was going to ask you. Yes.
are some of these ideas, like we just were talking about risk and resilience, some things like in a conversation, there's a core concept in clowning of don't be interesting, be interested. Because you get out there and you're in all this makeup and you think it's all about me. Let me be interesting. It wears on the audience very quickly.
Right. Being
interested in the other person. And this is a core concept in great acting. It's just usually done said in a slightly different way. When you're on stage with a great actor, you feel so listened to. You are better.
Right.
Well, in a conversation, especially if you're having a performance review with someone who's been struggling, if you can listen to them, really listen to them, you're going to be able to figure out what the next step is. If you're trying to be interesting, which is you need to change, in these 7 ways. You know what I'm talking. So being able to train those and you and I had this when you have a client conversation. If you go in to try to be interesting, it's great to see you. You're the CEO here. We have 7 products we'd like to show you, and I've got a little slide on each one of these products. That's very different from what are the issues that you're facing. I noticed in the New York Times yesterday there was an article about this and that I'm guessing is going to affect your business in some ways. And then to have the skill, as a good actor would in a scene, to go, oh, wait a second. So I think you just said that these 3 things affected in this way. Did I get that right? Yes, I got that. Tell me more about that, and get that kind of rapport.
So let's use that. I don't really care about that.
Yeah.
Now, what do you do?
So they say, I don't care about. What do you care about?
Okay.
This and there is a thing with C-suite folks, which again you and I have explored extensively, which is you need to bring a calling card in.
Right.
You cannot come in just say, as a friend of ours will say, don't ever ask me what keeps you up at night.
Right.
I'll throw you out of my office because you're asking me, how can I sell you things? So
there's like a little bit of credentialization up front. Right.
So, but that for an actor, that's my little bit of a monologue. That's my opening speech that I have. But now can I play the scene with you? Can I listen in that deep way? Can I keep you talking in the moments? Can I offer something back? Can I wait to give a solution until, as we would in a play, we've really established the messy problem here and lived with it for a while?
You know what? It's funny that you say that, because you ever run across those people where they are appearing to listen, but they're really not listening. And part of what I always think is just, and then maybe this is the wrong way to think about it, but is literally genuine curiosity.
Yes, I love that.
Like if you're really curious about somebody, it will show.
Absolutely. That's one of the 3 principles that in Stand and Deliver that we came up for delivery is you have to be genuinely curious, you have to be genuinely generous, and then you have to make sure that your movements are in sync with what you're saying.
Right.
You have to be congruent.
Which we talked about at the beginning.
Yes.
Yep. You probably have engaged with thousands of executives. Is there one thing when you think about it where you step back and you go, gosh, I didn't expect that? Like maybe it's the way that they acted, they communicated, the way they used their body, the way they didn't use their body. Is there anything from a communication perspective that surprised you?
I'm gonna answer that in the positive because this is genuine.
It doesn't need to be negative. Yeah.
I have been surprised for almost 10 years now at how much people want to be better communicators. Even if I'm looking at them and in the back of my mind I'm going, oh man, I'm not getting paid enough to be here. They are going, tell me, let me try that. And it's sometimes the biggest thing I can offer is this idea of rehearsing rather than talking about something.
Right.
Because in a business setting, you're used to discussing it. And to make the difference between discussing is one thing. In theater, that's called a table read. But now you have to get up and try it. And as soon as people trust me enough to get up and try it and realize that that's the iteration they need to have, they try it, they see how it feels, they get a little feedback and keep trying it back and forth, they can make big, huge growth. And there is nothing, I'll tell you, more beautiful than having worked with someone and then see them on stage.
Like nail it. Yeah.
And nail it.
Yeah.
And when we work together and getting to hear you start to frame up and I hear you give these beautiful, clear,
all right, we don't need to talk about this anymore. No, I'm teasing. Hey, so Jeff, I have a presentation. I don't really have a presentation, but I have a presentation tomorrow, right? And you only have a minute or two with me. What's 1 or 2 things that you would tell me that I should absolutely do that would click? Obviously, you've got much more in-depth perspective and training and advice, but what's 1 or 2 things?
Start it off by putting yourself in their shoes and speak how you would want to hear it if you were a listener. Don't start it off about you.
Right.
Start it off from their perspective. Make sure that you bucket your ideas into 2 or 3 buckets, not 7 or 8. And I know you got a million ideas, bucket them into 3 or 2. And then make sure that you end aspirational rather than just transactional.
Do you see a lot of presentations end flat?
A lot of presentations end on Q&A, which can be great if your last question is wonderful and you got a brilliant answer, but that last question might fall flat and
you're not in control then.
You're not in control and you have that peter out. I love the risk of Q&A because the reward is very high, but always recommend saving a moment to elevate, to summarize and elevate at the end so you've got some control at the end.
As you've told me, the dessert.
Have the dessert.
You got to have the dessert at the end. Okay, we're heading to the home stretch. You oftentimes talk about state, and you've talked. You haven't used those words necessarily, but you've talked around it a lot in this conversation.
Yes.
Can you talk about, because this was probably one of my biggest learnings when I began to engage with you, and I think it's actually so obvious, but it's one of the things that oftentimes presenters that are new to their craft don't do so well.
Yeah.
Talk about state and why it's so important.
So the idea of state is your emotional and psychological state, and it often manifests itself before and during a presentation. You get your nerves up, your stage is compromised. I'm sure most people listening to this have experienced and probably seen someone who has a compromised state when they're in a high-stakes situation, and you feel it immediately. It feels, I think to most of us, at least at the beginning, that there's nothing you can do. I didn't sleep well last night because I was worried about this. My palms always sweat. I turn red in a funny way. I'm doomed. And that's not true, because you look at great athletes and you look at performers, and people have routines
Right.
that allow them to be in a great state.
Can you talk about the one recommendation that you've given to me, which I think is something I've adopted and it's a game changer, and that's about not practicing your content up until you do the presentation?
Yeah. I have to credit Peter Myers from Stand and Deliver for this, because when I was an actor working full-time as an actor, I would always run my lines backstage before going on, thinking, this is great. I'm making sure that's there. What you're actually doing is getting your body going. I'm pacing backstage, running my lines, and your body's telling your brain, danger's coming. This is not good.
Because you may not know the content perfectly, or you're wondering whether or not you're prepared enough.
Right. That's what's going through your head.
Right.
So the simple idea that's worked for you, and it really works for me, is at 5, 10, whatever time you want to decide before you go on, you're done with content. It's there or not, but there's nothing you can do about it. The return on your investment is about your state. Mm-hmm. How you can be breathing correctly, how you can have your body open, how you can have whatever beliefs might be undercutting you. Like when I started doing this work, what's an actor doing in a corporate setting? I don't belong here. And all of that, if you can turn that around and say, what do I have to offer these people? Well, I do know about communicating. Okay, that, but I still don't belong. What else do you have to offer? Well, I do know how to move bodies. What else? So now my state's moving in the right direction.
Got it. So the whole notion of story, which I know you believe in, is kind of one of those vogue things nowadays. I think part of the challenge a lot of times people, I was going to say business people, but it's everybody.
Yep.
They have a hard time accessing a story that they feel like they can own.
Yeah.
Do you have any guidance on that?
Yeah, accessing a story that they think they can own and that they feel comfortable, and that there's a lot of state issues around how will this be perceived, because there's a risk in telling a story. And I'm not just talking about the content risk. I'm revealing something, that's a risk also. But the structure of a story is a more intimate relationship than a bullet point.
Right.
And ironically, a little riskier. The more details you get in a story, it feels risky. Somehow I'm revealing more than I want to reveal. And that's not a wrong way to think.
Right.
Finding stories in some ways is the easiest, though it seems like the biggest challenge.
I've seen that be like one of the insurmountable challenges, because people don't feel like they could find it that they actually think would be interesting. And when in fact, actually, if you step back, I mean, we are human beings with long histories. We usually have a lot that we can access.
The interesting is sometimes the point. It doesn't have to be interesting. Just like in improv,
that's a great point.
You hear some fabulous stories and you go, I've never been to the North Pole.
Right.
That's right. But you did go to the grocery store yesterday, and you might have learned something in the grocery store, if you frame it right, that is as powerful as that person who went to the
Jeff, you may have just hit it. People are always looking for that diamond in the rough, that perfect story. Yeah. And so everyone that they access is like, that's not going to be that good. And that's your point. It's like, actually, to own it and to be authentic, it actually has to be yours. And it doesn't have to be this grandiose, once in a lifetime story.
Yeah. When we work with Stand and Deliver, when I'm working on stories, I'll get a small group, breakout group, and we'll sit in a circle, and I'll make a joke that we would have a campfire, but it would burn the rug. And people just tell a story, and I give them a prompt, a time when you moved, a prompt, so people can think about it. And the biggest thing I have to worry about is if the first story is fabulous. Like I moved from Mount Everest to Mount Kilimanjaro, some fabulous move. I have to butt in after that and say, that was an amazing story. We don't have to match that. You can tell a simple story about your dog moving. And because that's the biggest danger, as you just said. No danger ever about the stories being boring. If they're about a human being, somehow in some kind of movement, it's interesting.
So one of the core tenets of our business's purpose is all around helping clients create trust in this world. How do you create trust with audiences?
I'm glad you brought up trust, because it's the center of all of these diagrams. So the reason you're working on your state, so that you come out in a state that's resourceful, is so that you can be present. And being present with an audience builds trust. The reason you work on your voice, so you're not in a monotone, is because it's a generous thing to shape your ideas with your voice so the audience can understand them easier and trust you. So each one of these, you've hit the key. Each one of these ideas around communication lead back to this idea of trust. If I'm really listening to you, and I demonstrate that by acknowledging what I've heard and asking questions that are built on what you've said, not on what I'm thinking to try to sell you,
right,
we're building trust.
So we're going to go through some lightning round questions. So these are like, 30 seconds or less. When I first of all, I don't know if everybody knows this, but I've known Jeff, maybe for almost 9 years, maybe now, 8 or 9 years. So we've known each other a long time.
Yes.
So I was astounded, and I shared this with you in advance, like all the things that you've done. You've been a clown, a juggler, an actor, a business founder, a writer, a facilitator. The list goes on and on and on. You're actually probably feeling pretty good about yourself right now.
Very good. Thank you.
But here's what I want to know. I am guessing, and it doesn't have to be the biggest challenge, but can you talk about a challenge that you've had in your career, something that's been significant, and how you overcame it? And if you could tie it back to like the world that we live in, business, that would be fantastic. But just a big challenge. And once again, it doesn't have to be the challenge, but something that
Thank you for not making it the challenge. I'm actually going to go back to the challenge of changing from being on the road with Cirque du Soleil to working in business setting. And it was challenging to my ego because I didn't have 3,200 people applauding twice a day at the end.
Interesting.
And it was challenging to my vision of myself, who I am. And it was challenging to my rhythm. It was a different kind of rhythm to prepare for these sessions. And usually when I'm working 12 hours straight in a day, and there's no food service. There usually is, but there's no costumer there. When you're a performer, especially if you're starring in something, you're taken care of in a different way. So all of this, but it really was, the challenge was really about my ego and my feelings and having to get that changed and get a different rhythm with my family. Because now I go on very short little tours. With Cirque du Soleil, I was gone a lot. So those are a couple of challenges there. You're
really active. We talked earlier about social media. So your activity on LinkedIn in particular, you're on Facebook and others, but has increased significantly over the last probably year and a half. Do you have one do and one don't for an executive when using social media? And while you're thinking about that, the reason why I'm asking is I have a view that you can really enhance your brand if you do social media right.
Yes.
There's a lot of bad social media out there. And I'm not talking about people saying things that are controversial. I'm just talking about stuff that just is boring and not interesting and people just don't engage with. So in the context of the business world, how you use social media, one do and one don't.
I'm pretty new at social media,
but you're good. So that's why
I have to thank Nancy Fitzgerald, who's a publicist who I worked with, who trained me. So the do is work on it, edit it a lot.
Don't just wing it.
And so that it sounds like you didn't edit it.
Right.
It's the same thing as clowning. You work so hard, so you're right there. But I edit, and then when I post it, I read it again in the formatting, and I edit it again. I'll correct Facebook posts where I have a grammatical mistake from 3 weeks ago because I'm an author. I don't want that sitting out there. So edit it so it sounds like you just.
But it also goes back to what you were talking about earlier about just the language that you use as well. Mm-hmm. Remember how you were talking about like in a meeting, it's the pre-meeting, everybody's talking like humans. In the meeting, people are talking like drones, right?
Yeah.
And what I think you're saying is like actually write it like you're a human.
Yeah. But make sure that you've got some meat underneath that, but you're a human talking about that meat, and that takes work.
Yeah.
It really does. It takes craft, and you need to, so taking more time than you think.
Okay. So
it
that's
always
a do.
takes you more time
What's
than
a
you think.
don't?
A don't, I'm going to give you two don'ts.
So,
don't put a bad picture with it because it doesn't matter how brilliant it is. No one's going to read it if you got a bad picture.
That's a good point.
That surprised me, but that's
your pictures are good, by the way.
Some of them are.
Yeah.
I can tell you which ones aren't. And then don't be arrogant. Have humility. And a lot of mine are teaching. I'm trying to bring value to the reader.
Yeah.
But I have to make sure I'm not going, you need to listen to me, because I'm not on a soapbox. I'm bringing the humility. Oftentimes, I'm learning from someone else is the teaching thing, and I try to keep that.
Oh my God, I'm so glad you said that, because what I love is when somebody says, I made this mistake,
Yep.
versus you should do this. Drives me nuts. Even though you know they're probably doing it to bring you in,
Yeah.
it just, it goes back to the ego, and I'm totally there with you. Why is humor so important in the workplace? You've written about that.
I have. Humor keeps us human. Humor also is a sign, a symptom, if you will, or a result of connection. So if you're connecting with other human beings, like if you saw a couple of people, if we walk out on the street and we see a group of people laughing and we had a transcription of what they had said before, we would not laugh.
Right.
They're laughing because they're connected. So if you've got a workplace that has connection in it, you're going to have some laughter in there, and people are feeling human. Telling jokes is not necessarily the way to go.
Right.
It's about connecting and connecting over time so that you're human together.
So we titled this podcast Resilient. The question I always ask, and this is not my last question because I have a special one to end it on. I usually end with this. But the question is, what are the attributes of a resilient performer, business person? It doesn't matter. And then who is somebody in your life, personal or professional, it doesn't matter, that embodies those attributes?
I like that question. The things that are crucial in the business setting and in the theatrical setting or circus setting are the people. Resilience is being there when you're supposed to be there, fully engaged and fully connected every time.
Mm-hmm.
The bad day you had yesterday, the bad flight connections, all of that becomes secondary. They don't disappear for resilient people. They become secondary to the fact that you and I are here and we're doing this work together. And to bring a little joy to that feels like resilience.
And who would embody that?
I'm going to go with my long-term clown partner. I've worked with Diane Wozniak for many, many years. And she's an odd version on that because she likes to complain about things. She'll just go on and on. Is it okay if I tell you a quick story on this?
Oh, absolutely.
So we were in Quad Cities, Idaho, Iowa. I don't remember quite where. There's 4 cities there on 2, and we were doing school shows, and for 2 weeks, just the two of us. And it's not the glamour life, can I tell you? And so we had a 7 a.m. show. Yeah, we had to be there to set up at 7 a.m. at a high school about an hour's drive away. And the whole way down, we're sucking our coffee. And Diane used to be a truck driver, and so she's driving. And we are complaining, and I am tired. And we get set up, and I remember thinking, I'll give about 75% because this is tour and no one cares. And Diane is about a quarter of my size. And she never gives anything under than 100%. She could be complaining, but as soon as we hit the stage, I swear to God, that audience didn't see me. I mean, they saw her. And at the end, I'm loading the van, and she's signing autographs. And I thought, never again. That's what professional looks like, but that's also resilient. She is as tired as me. We both got as little sleep, and she drove. But at the moment, she won the audience.
Let's close it on this. What's the clown's biggest secret?
That you earn your living by being deeply connected with an audience, not by finding those funny jokes.
Jeff, thank you very much. That was great.
Thank you, Mike.
Well, that was a whole lot of fun for me. Jeff, thank you very, very much for your time. I'm hoping that everybody was able to pick up something during this interview that you can apply at work or at home. For me, I personally love the acrobat analogy and the importance of defined roles: the flyer, the base, and the observer. Each one of them has a critical role in risk. From the flyer who actually takes the risk to the spotter who operates under the assumption that something is going to go wrong. I also love the tips that Jeff gave that any one of us can apply during our next high stakes presentation. And that actually happens a lot. For me, What I loved was the need to think about my personal state before a presentation versus what I think I would always do is practice the content right up until the last minute. That's not a good thing to do, we learned from Jeff. I want to thank everybody who subscribes and listens to Resilient, a Deloitte podcast produced by our friends at Ribbit. You can find us at Deloitte.com or visiting your favorite podcatcher, keyword Resilient. And if you're enjoying these conversations, please share them with work colleagues, family, and friends. And I'd also be really grateful if you could spend 1 minute with a rating. Ratings do play a huge role in how our podcast gets promoted. You can also hit me up on LinkedIn and Twitter. I've been getting a lot of engagement on LinkedIn, so send any messages, like the content we put out there, or even connect with me. My profile is under Michael Kearney, Kearney. On Twitter, mkearney33.